Welcome to episode 3 of Captain's Compass. In this edition, we're going to cover data engineering. In the first two, we've covered a BI analyst and analytics engineers. If you missed those two episodes, click the link above and check those out. In this episode, we cover what it's like to be a data engineer in the day-to-day life, what tools you use, and we even cover the pesky AI topic. Without further ado, let's dive into episode 3 of Captain's Compass.
My name is Brian Toole. I'm the data engineer at Steno.
I know from talking to you before our meeting, I know there's been a little bit of change up in your life. So you wanted to kind of talk through kind of your journey in your data path so far, like where you started and kind of where you are now?
Sure. So I say I backed into the modern data space. More often than not, someone that's working in modern data, they may be coming from an analyst background or a data science background, and they're getting introduced to engineering principles through DBT and through the modern stack. And I came the other way. I have over 15 years of experience with on-premise and hosted transactional database development. Uh, you know, Always really enjoyed working with SQL and thought it was limited but great. And then I stumbled across DBT and realized, hey, this is a cool piece of technology. It's supplementing SQL language with just neat functionality that's been missing. Use Jinja to do some iterative and some functional programming that doesn't really exist in SQL unless you're looking at Oracle cursors, which only work on Oracle. If you try and use cursors on SQL Server, good luck. Um, and so I've been now in the modern space for about 3 years. Uh, I we recorded a session of this back in, was it, I don't know, August, September,
2020, 2019, something like that.
a while ago, and I actually reached back out to Stephen because I recently had a job shift. So we're recording this now as I'm starting a new role. And so it's similar in functionality. It's still modern data space, some unique opportunities that come along with it, uh, different industry. So some perks, but it's a bit of a bittersweet thing because I'm leaving behind a fantastic team and just excited for what's coming up next.
Yeah, I feel like this is like the Brian's version, like the door Taylor Swift play, like where you're. Anyways, no, it's maybe we don't have to go on the Taylor Swift train on this interview series. No, yeah. So you mentioned like you're switching industries, and that's something that I don't have enough experience in the space yet to like really have an opinion on. But like some people say, like data's data, right? Like whether it's no matter where you're working, data's data. But like, do you feel like there's a big shift in like the way that you have to work depending on which industry you're in?
Now, no. I've been in health tech for close to a decade, and back when I first got into health tech, a lot of the job postings required healthcare experience. And so back then, I think there was a lot more focus on industry experience. But as the time has passed, as technology has changed, as the modern data stack has come up, and I'd say as overall more people have gotten into data, that's been less relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you've been in medtech for a while, so I'm assuming you like working in medtech, or else you wouldn't stay there so long. So what do you like about that industry in particular?
I've always liked feeling like what I'm doing is making a positive impact on a person's life. And I don't always feel like you get that in some other industries. Granted, I haven't experienced a lot of the industries out there, but marketing and ad tech hasn't ever really been interesting to me. I started in education, worked for a university, did a brief stint in private finance. I really didn't enjoy the private finance environment. Um, I mostly got into health tech because it was going to open doors. I really didn't have a whole lot of industry attachment at the time, but then once I got in there, it was really easy to go from different aspects of health tech. So I started at a health insurance company, and then I went to a couple of startups, and so it kind of not really trapped me in there, but that seemed to be the logical progression at that point, just to different areas of health tech. Because when you look at our healthcare system is kind of a mess, and there are many different approaches you can take to try and fix something, whether it's fix something about the system or make someone's life easier and take on some of the responsibility away from them. And so that was appealing. Now I'm starting a new industry in the legal tech space, in a company that's apparently revolutionizing court reporting.
Everyone's revolutionizing everything, right?
Oh yeah,
Which I mean,
absolutely.
honestly, there's a lot of places that revolutionizing needs to happen, like the healthcare space. So
And that's what
completely
startups
understand
try
that.
and do in general. They're going to try and make an impact.
It's
They're going
fair.
to try and change something. And having worked in corporate environments, you know, higher education and uh, health insurance, not those don't feel as good to me. Whereas a lot of startups, they are trying to change something. You are able to really make an impact either on your organization due to the organization's size or on whatever the company's goal is fundamentally.
Yeah, and so I know like you just switched roles. I know we talked a little bit beforehand, but obviously like you weren't like actively applying for jobs. So can you kind of talk about what that process looked like to actually land this role?
I'd say mine is different than the process that a lot of people in the job market are going to go through. I happen to uh, I'd say a lot of it was get lucky with seeing a position pop up when it did, and it happened to align with things that were interesting to me. I also happened to know someone that worked there at the time, and so just a few things aligned that made this pretty much fall into my lap. Not necessarily that the offer fell into my lap by any means, but the opportunity to pursue it fell in there. Uh, I think the market as a whole is a lot more challenging, especially if you're looking at mid-level or entry-level role, because there are a lot of boot camps. There are a lot of people getting introduced to data, and just the volume of people that are trying to find work, that are trying to maybe change to a different direction in their career, trying to you know uh, recover after being laid off. A lot of different things have happened recently that have caused a flood of individuals trying to find jobs. I've talked to a couple of colleagues from past jobs, and they'd been off work for a few months trying to find something. So I think a lot of it does really fall down to being in the right place at the right time or seeing the right role come along.
Yeah, and not just that, but like also like data teams are like getting their budget shrunk down, or like they don't have as many like there's not as many positions to be hired too, right? Like, so it's just like big combination of all this stuff, and I think it's one of the things that I've learned kind of in the business world since I've came into it is it used to make me angry, but like getting jobs is a lot easier if you know the people that you're applying to, right? Like, and I say that like you've talking about the role that you landed. Like, I landed my role at Shipyard because like Blake, the CEO, and I like developed a relationship with me using the tool and talking to him about it. Like, it made me getting that role really easy. It was I had a contact, like, you still went through the application process, but like I was being coached through it, right? And I say like for someone that's looking for a role, would you say it's probably the best tip that you can give them right now is like get to know people, like network well?
Network well, make connections, don't close doors. I think don't close doors is kind of paramount. Always leave your employers on good terms if you can, because you never know when you're going to talk to or work with some of these people again. It could be a future opportunity. It could be a random question that pops up in a shared Slack server. Um, you know, don't close those doors. Always try and maintain the connections as much as possible, and uh, reach out, ask questions, just talk to the people that you've worked with in the past. They might not be able to help you at all. They might not be able to do anything, but just by having uh, that connection, that relationship, it goes a long way.
Right, because like they might not be able to help you get a job, but like could help you with interview questions, could help you. with a recommendation if you need it. It could help, if their network's bigger than yours on LinkedIn or something, it could help boost a post or something by you, right? Like all that stuff is super helpful. And like, I don't know, like I said, when I came into the field, I was like super bitter because like some of my friends were getting jobs in college that like they had some connections that I didn't have. Like maybe their parents worked at a company and like got got an opportunity there, or like maybe they had met someone at a networking event that I didn't meet. It was like super frustrating because like I wish it was all based on skills, but like that's just not the way the world works, right?
No, and even then, skills assessment varies from company to company. Um, it's especially in the data engineering space, your skills are not equal everywhere. And it's kind of hard to say that because you put a lot of time into growing your skills. But I look at where I'm at now, and I know for a fact that there are data engineer positions out there that are maybe lower in seniority than my current role that I couldn't do just because I'm not exposed to that tech stack. I'm not exposed to that type of data engineering work. And I think that makes it especially challenging for people trying to land a data engineering role. The variability is way too high. You've got some companies out there that are looking for data engineers that maybe are more in the analytics engineering skill set. You've got some out there that are looking to work heavily with streaming data and work heavily with real-time data. You've got some out there that are, on a more legacy stack using SSIS to do just batch ETL all over the place. All of those could be considered data engineers. And so I think it's really important to have an idea of what you want to be working with, as well as making sure when you're applying and when you're pushing for these roles, it's with technologies that either you're familiar with or you're interested in learning. I wouldn't personally apply to a role that was 100% real-time streaming data just because that's not as interesting to me. That's not the background I come from. That's not the skill set or technologies I'm used to. That would be a hard sell. That would be hard for me to ramp up if I got there. Not saying that I couldn't. I think anyone that can apply themselves to learning a technology, learning a new approach will succeed well. But I think the reward needs to be there.
Yeah, and that's what like whenever we created this series of Captain's Compass, like this like sub series on like data roles, like what I hoped to happen at the end of this series, I'd be able to interview someone from every single role, and like we'd be able to like put together like a nice piece of information saying like, hey, a data engineer is this, hey, a data analyst is this, and it's not,
Good
and
luck.
like there's
Yeah.
not that, yeah, right, like that's just not something that can ever be put together because just like you said, like a data engineer can mean 7,000 things, right? Because it can depend on the data stack, like you talked about, depend on like what kind of type of data, whether they want to do batch or real time or any of that stuff, right? And then it can also depend on how big the organization is, right? Like if you're going into a small organization, as a data engineer, you might have to build dashboards too, right? Like you might have to be like get into Looker or Tableau and actually do some dashboard work. So there's like so many variables.
Yeah, you could be a one-person data team that's a data engineer that's handling the analytics work. You could be on a 10-person data team and your sole focus is the ingestion component. You could be using a third-party tool for ingestion, having to maintain a bunch of connections there, or you could be creating your own ingestion pipelines strictly by writing Python.
Yeah, no, it's overwhelming, especially like I think in like the middle roles, I think are where it gets like really really confusing. Like data engineering, like can mean I think it might be the most open ended position in the space. Like maybe the data analyst might be first and data engineer be second, but like
I feel like data scientist might also be a tricky one because so many companies say we want to use data science. We want a data scientist. And then the data scientist comes on and says, oh, we don't have any sort of data infrastructure here. And where does it go from there? Well, do they hire for that? Or more likely, do they leverage their data scientists to suddenly build a bunch of infrastructure that could fall to a data engineer, data platform engineer, whatever role you see out there?
right. No, yeah, it's what I remember whenever I was coming out, I talked to this consultant where I was kind of having a similar conversation I'm having with y'all now, like just kind of I don't know what any of these positions mean. Like, I don't even know what to apply for at this point. Like, can you help me? Just tell me what these roles do. And I remember he told me a data scientist is like someone that like obviously can like do machine learning and like things like that, but like at the end of the day, data scientists should be able to do everything. Is what he told me, and he was like, "There's no reason you should ever apply to be a data scientist at this point in your career because you should be able to like do data engineering, you should be able to do data analyst, you should be able to write models, you should be able to do the extraction, the transform, like all this stuff." And it's like, wow, it's a lot going on there.
Well, and I think the other thing you'll see is a lot of companies will hire, the data analyst and the data scientist first, and that might not be the expertise they need to really get something that's scalable and efficient for either of those functions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's. I hope that we're learning. I've seen more articles about it, so I'm hoping that we're learning as an industry. But like, unless you have good data, like you can't make machine learning models, right? Like unless you have good data coming in, like you're not gonna be able to make good dashboards.
Garbage in, garbage
It's
out.
not gonna be reliable. That's right. Yeah. It's yeah. So yeah. So anyway, so shifting over. So we've talked a little bit about tools so far. So if you had to say, like, if someone that wants to get into data engineering, they can't focus on all the tools, right? Like that would be overwhelming. There's too many. But like, what tools would you kind of say are essentials, or maybe not specific tools, but like, what area should someone who's wanting to get in data engineering like focus on before they start applying for jobs?
I'd say number one is SQL. Absolutely focus on SQL. Uh, no matter what part of the spectrum you fall in for data engineering, SQL is going to be a core component to it because you need to interact with a database. And maybe not 100% of the time, but you know, there are always exceptions to the rule. But I'd say a good chunk of the time you're going to be writing queries against the database. You're going to be optimizing queries. You're going to be really trying to capture that population of data that you're trying to pass through on any particular pipeline.
Yeah. So how would you say would be the best way for them to go about learning SQL, and like where would you send them to go? So like I've had friends that have reached out to me that, because I used to be a teacher, so like they're like, "Hey, Steven, we saw that you switched in from teaching into this world. Like, how'd you do it? Like, what would you do?" And I'm like, "Oh boy, I don't know if I have the right answer for you." So like, would you tell them to try to get into DBT and try to use DBT, or like try to write SQL and like a service like a data camp or something like that? Like, where would you want to send them?
There are some great resources online for just learning the basics and fundamentals of SQL. That's a good place to start. I think DBT is also a great place to start because it really is just writing select statements. It's doing a lot of the actual building of the tables, views, the various database objects. It's doing that behind the scenes, so you really just focus on the query itself. And so I think that's the most crucial. SQL is a very easy to write poorly language. And there's probably a better way to say that, but it's really easy to write a SQL query, a single select statement. It's not so easy to write that in a scalable, performant, readable manner. And SQL allows you to make it less readable, which is annoying to me because readability, I think, is more important than writability. It has a bunch of optional keywords that help understand what something's doing that you can omit. Um, that's not great for someone that's just trying to learn how to use the language.
Yeah, it's kind of like in the video game world, right? Where you want your video game to be, you want it to be something that's like easy for someone to pick up, but you want it like to be hard to master, right? It's like, and that's kind of what SQL is too, right? Where it's like, I remember in college when they introduced SQL, I was like, I can just like do select this column from a table, and like that's the homework assignment, and like it was at the beginning, which I'm not a great SQL writer by any stretch of the imagination, but like it is something that's like very easy to pick up, but then once you want to actually get it into actually doing it in production, it ramps up on you, right? Where it's like you're going to be spending 10 times more money with that bad query that you wrote versus an actual optimized one.
Yeah, it's funny too because you can optimize a query for a low volume of data, and it won't be the same level of performance for a high volume of data. It's really easy to have a query that runs in under a second for 1,000 rows, but then when you get into a billion or a trillion rows, it takes minutes. Well, you don't want a query taking minutes, especially if it's used for any sort of BI. If someone comes in and tries to load up a dashboard and it sits for a minute, they're not going to be happy.
Yeah, from experience, I know all about that, unfortunately. So,
I think most of us who have been in
so yeah,
this world for a while know all about that.
we've had those conversations. Yeah. So we mentioned DBT a few times. So I think that's an answer I always give to people who want to break into a space because I'm like, if you can get good writing SQL and you can understand how to use DBT, I think that sets you up to like get a good role in the space because DBT obviously is a huge leader in our space. So can you kind of, if you had to give me like an elevator pitch on like why using like what advantages DBT has granted you in your career at this point versus when you didn't have it, how would you describe that to someone who hasn't used it before?
It's tricky because again, my perspective is skewed a bit. Um, I think DBT in general was designed to introduce engineering principles to analysts and to data scientists and to those that know how to work with SQL, but they might not be familiar with version control. They might not be familiar with a CI/CD pipeline. Uh, it's allowed some of that to leak over into people. For me, I think it's more the additional enrichments that are provided. So anyone that works with data long enough has encountered ambiguous source data. It's going to happen. Um, just the ability to provide documentation around what that source data means, the nuances to it, and to have that documentation trickle down through the lineage. The other big component, I think, is the lineage. Being able to track data starts over here, and it goes here, 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 here. Currently, DBT doesn't really support column level lineage, but it does have that table level DAG, which simplifies things a lot. Thinking back to working with a whole host of SQL Server stored procedures, trying to track the flow of data from one to another when you're looking at 100 different stored procedures that get called sequentially or in parallel or at different times conditionally, it's a pain. So just having that visibility into the lineage is huge and extremely helpful. Then I'd say the third big piece that DBT introduces that is lacking in a lot of the stored procedure development is testing. It's somewhat limited depending on whether you're using just the out of the box DBT tests or if you're bringing in, you know, third party packages or writing your own. But it lets you define source tests. It lets you define uh, relationship tests, so you can again be alerted to some degree when the data is not what you expect it to be.
Yeah, I remember my very first job in the field. I was working for a lumber company in Tuscaloosa, and I was a one man data team. Didn't know that whenever I signed up for the job, but there I was. And the consultant did all the work to like get the data to like at least a starting point for me, and it was all with stored procedures inside a SQL Server, and didn't leave any documentation to tell me how anything was built. Like he was just like, "Oh, it's all in the code," and boy, like my next organization used DBT, and I was like, that is the biggest thing for me. Is like, there's no more guessing. Like, I don't have to go research for hours to try to figure out where this stuff came from. If an error happens, I can trace it and go back to where it came from, which is a huge time saver.
The other thing that's really frustrating about some of those legacy systems is depending on the database, you can have configuration set so you have case sensitivity on object names, on column names, on really anything. So you could have a users table with a capital U and a users table with a lowercase u, and they're two different tables. Imagine the nightmare of trying to just remember which one to use, or why is this data wrong? I'm selecting from lowercase users. Well, really, you need to select from uppercase users because that's just how it exists for some reason. Um, you know, why you would configure it that way, I don't know. Uh, I mean, I'm sure people that do it have perfectly valid reasons for it. Um, the fact that it's possible is kind of infuriating to work with.
It's fair. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's yeah. Case sensitivity is always a lot. I don't know, like naming conventions in general. Like that was something that last organization we fought about all the time. Was like simple stuff like using using underscores or doing doing like capitals for every word. Like it's like, why do we care so much about this nonsense? But it's like we just got to agree on something, right? And those conversations are always heated.
One thing there are two things I always say at really any job I've been at. The first is naming things is hard. naming things is easily going to be one of the hardest aspects of being a data engineer, because you want to come up with a concise name for something, whether it's a table or column, a process, but you don't want it to be just a whole bunch of acronyms. I'm not sure if you've ever worked with Oracle's Banner ERP system, but it has a bunch of core tables that's defined, and it has a very specific naming convention. It's 7 character long names, at least it was at the time. The first 3 characters mean one thing, or I guess each of the 3 characters mean one thing, and then the last 4 characters tend to be an abbreviation. So you'll end up with tables that are called PEBEMPL, PEBEMPL, and the first the first character meant that it was part of the payroll module. I always forget what the second character meant. The third character indicated if it was a base table or a repeating table. Then the last 4 characters, EMPL, employee. So it was the employee table within the payroll module, and it was a base table, but it was called PEBEMPL. That's not the most you know easy to understand. Then you'd get some really funny tables like RCRAP, RCRAPP, um, and they were application tables. But when you have a naming convention like that, you just end up with really obscure, hard to read things. The other side of the coin is you don't want a column name to be 30 characters in length. You know, depending on your environment, you might not even be able to have something 30 characters in length. That's going to mess with the readability. That's going to mess with writability. Just not great. The second thing I always say, and this always makes me laugh, but it's consistency is overrated. And I just say that because you're never going to see consistent data. You're always going to come across inconsistencies, whether it be in uh, you know 2 different sources with what should be the same value but isn't, or 2 different definitions for the same term. And it's a bit facetious when I say it that way, but it's true. You know, we always want to strive for consistency, but know that you're always going to find inconsistency no matter how hard you try.
All right, so steering us into a discussion about AI because we got to have one, right? We're gonna keep it short and sweet though. So as a data engineer who's done the job for a while now, um, obviously like we both see the doom and gloom articles, right? Where like data engineering is gonna be dead because of AI. Like you've read the articles or at least seen them. I don't know that I don't know that I can say that I've read them, but I've seen the titles pop up on LinkedIn, right? Does do you currently like are you currently like looking at like how to use AI in your roles? Like does it worry you at all? What is your kind of opinion on what's going on in that space right now?
It does not worry me. Um, Usage, I think, is you know it has its place. Same with everything else in the data space. Uh, I'm cautious with it, and this could be because I haven't used it a ton to this point. But when I think about the things I would use it for, the 2 that really come to mind are document generation and query generation. So with document generation, if you're trying to get a document written for, say, maybe a column description for a primary key, a lot of the first attempts might be this is the primary key for this table. Well, that's not really helpful because that doesn't provide context. What does this conceptually mean? And I think it could be easier than I saying it is. I'll admit to not knowing for sure, but I think a lot of the time you're going to come across generated documentation that is lacking that context that you want. And in the time it would take to get that context added, you could easily just manually add the documentation. That being said, manually adding documentation is not fun. It's very tedious and no one likes doing it. But I think right now it's going to be the fastest way, especially if you're just standing something new up to get that context in there. Query generation is also another one I'm not super worried about. If you've ever used any modern BI tool, you'll see it often generates queries behind the scenes. And if you try and read one of the auto-generated queries, it's going to be gross. It's going to be ugly because it can't necessarily tailor things like aliases and CTE names to, again, context. It's going to pick something arbitrary like, TBL for a table or CTE for a CTE. That's fine for auto generation behind the scenes, but readability really starts to suffer. And at that point, you start to get into code obfuscation. Um, if you've ever tried to maintain obfuscated code in production, it's an absolute nightmare because not only do you have to be able to follow the columns along, where is this data coming from, but you also somehow have to attach context to a table that's been aliased to the letter A. So again, I'm not super worried. I'm sure you can use it to generate, uh, you know, passable queries that work. But because I pride and prioritize readability over anything else, uh, unless the query is extremely non-performant, uh, I think readability is a must. And I haven't seen any good examples of auto-generated code that are both readable and performant.
Yeah, that's the answer I give everybody to with AI is like, yeah, it can like help. I think there's like spots for us to help us, but like until AI can understand business context, like it's never going to be able to like be able to use because that's what we currently miss with humans working in the data space is like understanding like business context in the data world.
And if you don't understand the context, how do you expect the AI to understand the context?
Yeah, how are we going to train AI to get there if we don't even know how to do it ourselves? So, no, yeah, I'm with you on that. So, okay, that's the AI portion of this show. So we'll shift over. So, so talking about data engineering in general. So, a big goal of the series is again just educating people that want to get into the role. So, some general questions about the space. So, what would you say is probably your favorite thing about being a data engineer?
The diversity of work that I do, I think that's really exciting to me. Some days I could be focused on tuning a query's performance. Other days I could be focused on ingesting a new data source. I could be focusing on troubleshooting, a query. Why is this data wrong? Uh, it's hard to fall into a same thing every day routine in the data engineering space. I think I'm sure people have done it. Especially since the data engineering space is so bloated and messy as it is. Uh, but I haven't experienced that since I've really started to get into this modern space.
Yeah, I think that's something for data in general is like if you put yourself out there, like you can make your days all be varied, right? And like even like as a BI analyst, right? Like you could set yourself down to like just create like the same type of dashboards every day, but like if you really put yourself out there, it can really put you in situations that you might have to build some pipelines, right? Like maybe you probably shouldn't based on your role, but like if the needs are there, like you might be able to help out with those, right? And I think that's what I love about this the space so much is like every day in my life, like who knows I'm gonna do at work that day. And that's something like whenever I used to be teaching, that was something that like I really struggled with. Is like I'm gonna teach this same lesson to 5 classes of kids today, and I got to basically say the same thing 5 times in a row, and that was rough. Like I struggled to do that because I'm like and then if you forget to say something, then it's like you're ruining this one class's education. Which, anyways, we'll talk about teaching more in another episode. So that's your favorite thing. So what would you say maybe is your least favorite thing of working as a data engineer?
Despite the diversity, you will do tedious work. Especially if you're trying to add documentation uh, for data that hasn't been defined, that really hasn't existed. Writing doc blocks for DBT is not the most interesting thing. Creating YAML files, not the most interesting thing. Um, Dealing with vendors, not fun most of the time. Think about third-party data that you might be trying to consume, and you're stuck waiting on a response because for some reason the source that their documentation says you should see is not what you actually see. Um, there can be moments of just having a problem that you can't answer yourself, and you're stuck waiting for other people to answer it for you. That can be very frustrating. But overall, there's not a whole lot that I don't enjoy about my role.
So finishing up here, so we talked about what you liked about liked about data engineering, what you don't like about data engineering. So I feel like we have a pretty good feel on what the world of data engineering looks like. So where do you kind of see this role kind of evolving in the next like 10, 15, 20 years? Like where do you kind of see things going? I know like obviously we're not fortune tellers, we don't know the future, but like, there's some like hints out there that you can kind of get a feel of what's coming. Like what do you think is kind of like going to be like up and coming and new in this space in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think you're going to see uh, the push for AI integration with things coming up a lot more. Hopefully that's a positive. Hopefully it's able to incorporate that context a lot more. I, I think it's going to be tough to evolve the data engineer as it's currently defined now, though, because there's such variability to it. I could foresee a split uh, where maybe data engineering is no longer a thing, but you've got, and we've seen it a little bit so far with analytics engineering that popped up out of data engineering to focus on the analytics side. But you could see a bit more of a split to, maybe separate real-time data engineering from batch-oriented data engineering. Um, but it's hard to say for sure because I think as a whole, data engineering is not really sure what it wants to be. If that makes sense. Like is still containing everything that's not a application engineer, not an analyst, not a data scientist. It's kind of that leftover stuff that is being lumped together. I did think of my train of thought from before though. Um, the the frustrating thing that you often have to deal with is the fact that the priorities that you want to work on or the efforts that you want to work on, especially if it's around maintaining tech debt, if it's around optimizing something, that might not be aligned with what the business needs you to work on. And so you could have this thing that it could be a quick win that you just want to get done, but you can't focus on it because you have A, B, C, D, and E that are more crucial money makers to prioritize. But as long as this thing over here sits, it's going to make everything else gradually harder.
Yeah, for sure. It's always a consistent battle between like making the systems that exist currently better and like doing new stuff, right? And it's always a back and forth on that. So, I guess finishing up with one last question here. How do y'all as an organization take those requests in? Like how do y'all manage, like I don't mean like y'all use Jira or something like that, right? But like how do y'all manage what you pick to work on? Like how do you kind of prioritize those things?
That is going to vary drastically based on where you work. Instead of saying what I've done in the past, I think I can talk about what I'd like to see and what my preference is. I've seen companies try to use a formal, I guess, sprint focused process with a data team, and data teams inherently get ad hoc requests that don't lend themselves well to a defined sprint so much. So one thing I've done in the past that I really enjoyed was an approach of these are the things that are high priority for the organization. Here's what we're going to try and work on for the next week or 2 weeks or however long your iteration is defined. And then here are this big section of time or story points or however you organize your work defined as unknowns that will come up and need to bump something else out. So we, I guess, in the past we've used like a Kanban style board with a bit of kind of iteration planning mixed in with it. And when the team as a whole knows company priorities, when the team as a whole knows what the KPIs are, whatever your quarterly or monthly or you know unit of measurement you have you know focus is, know what those the work efforts are that are going to tie directly to those, do the best you can to prioritize them, and people just pull as they free up. Oh, I'm done with story A, I can now take story B and start working on that, and get some of that, I guess, that individual prioritization, and that again, I'm blanking on the word, but the you know, I guess the responsibility of each individual member on the team to um, you know based on company focus what their next individual focus should be.
Yeah, that would be a good world to live in, right? Is that if we could all communicate the KPIs and what's like, the priorities of the company, where like those decisions become pretty obvious. That'd be a rosy world for us to live in, right?
Yeah, it's especially tricky in startup environments where the focus can change like that. People often say startups move faster, and I disagree with that. I don't think startups move any faster. I think the rate of change is higher. I think the focus shifting is a lot more frequent, and that I think can be perceived as moving faster when instead it's just adapting a lot more.